Japan up close.
From a management perspective, diversity is, rather than describing difference or even identifying or imagining difference, because diversity can be what we sometimes say real in the sense it can be measured, it can be identified, observed over time, and or it can be perceived. We can often perceive diversity, or more in Japan, I think, difference, where there is no real difference there. But let's just start with the real diversity. It's measurable. We can research it. It's scientific. So, for example, as a colleague of mine at my home university, the University of London, he's a geneticist, okay, and I asked him about diversity, and he said to me, Keith, he said, if you look at the genetic structure of human beings, it doesn't matter what their race or religion or even their gender is. He says, if you look at the genetic structure of human species, then there's diversity, obviously, in terms of hair color, eye color, shape of nose, and so on. We get all of that, plus biological diversity in terms of gender. Okay, we get that. He said, actually, the biggest difference in the genetic structure of human beings is this, that basically, in terms of genetic structure, the biggest difference between human beings around the world is earlobes. He says there are human beings with what are called hanging earlobes, and there are human beings with what are called attached earlobes. And within the genetic structure of human beings, that is the biggest difference. So when we're talking about diversity strategy in Japan, we're discussing it from the perspective of those individuals or groups in Japanese society who have or claim the resources to formulate and implement strategies in relation to people who are or appear diverse. So we want to get beyond difference, okay? So that's where I'd start from. I mean, I must say, there's a Japanese researcher, sociologist, Sugimoto Sensei. I'm not sure if our listeners have heard of him. He's actually based in La Trobe University in Australia now. And he's written a book for Routledge in, I think, 3 editions now, called Sociology, an Introduction to Sociology Japan, I think it's called. And he writes a lot about diversity in Japan. And I found that very informative and instructive because, this professor and others that he researches with, they have evidence of rich diversity in Japan, both historically and now, in terms of, not just dialect or language, but, educational background, ethnicity, ambition, across the regions of Japan, different, cuisines, which has related to different kind of life expectancies, different ranges of diseases. These are fundamental, these are foundations for societies generally and people's lives generally. So I think that's a good place to start. The question really is, when we come to talk about diversity, is okay, if we recognize differences in other people and between other people and ourselves, what do we do with that? That's the important thing. It's not, we don't stop at description. We move on to, okay, what can we achieve or create out of these differences if we have identified them? And that's where, as I'll say later, I think where courage comes in, where leadership comes in, and where education comes in. Not to feel threatened by difference, for example. And then to see, okay, how can we make differences work? Diversity is a buzz phrase. I mean, this is perhaps one other difference currently between Japan and countries I've worked with in Europe. It's not just that researchers in Europe have been looking at diversity and diversity management for 20, 30 years now. It's that it's almost become, well, it is standard now in employment policies and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that diversity is managed effectively in Western countries compared to Japan, not at all. But it's explicit, it's out there. And if something's explicit, then if we have a fairly open organizational culture or institutional culture, then if it's out there, it's explicit, we can both look at it and say, well, what do you understand by this diversity policy? I understand it this way. What do you understand it as? And it's important to make it explicit and shared as a common point of reference, rather than each person walks around with their own perception and conceptualization of diversity. So we're going to talk strategy later. So from a strategic perspective, it's about performance. The argument is in diversity management that if we bring together people as managers or project team leaders, if we bring together people from different, early life experiences, different education experiences, different professional backgrounds, different gender experiences in society, if we bring together people with diverse experiences and perspectives, if we bring them together to question, to observe, to question, to analyze a complex problem, then the argument is for diversity management is that diversity of perspective and questions and experiences and perceptions and ambitions, they can help us to see these complex problems in more detail, in more facets of it. And that's the argument. So when I said then, it's about more than people, it is from a management perspective. It's about what individuals can bring to, for example, solving a problem. It's not about the individuals, it's about what they can bring to the solving of a problem. It's about performance. Diversity in the context of managing people or managing organizations or interacting with people, diversity is an argument. It's not a fact. But let me give you an example of performance that is observable, measurable. So let's take baseball teams. So you have a baseball coach, and then you have the players on the pitch when they're fielding or when they're batting, okay? Let's say if we said to a baseball coach that he or she, it's probably a he, that for this next baseball match, this next baseball game, he can only choose pitchers, no specialist batters, no specialist fielders, only pitchers. Now, the coach would probably say, well, I can't see the team being successful if we have only one type of player. We need fielding specialists, we need pitchers specialists, we need batting specialists and different types of batting specialists. Yeah, that's diversity. It's diversity for performance. It's identifying which players have particular skill sets or experience, and then mixing them together in order to produce a team performance that should be competitive and perhaps stronger than the other team. And the baseball team will be changed slightly. The people in the baseball team will be changed slightly according to the opposition, the strengths and weaknesses of the opposition. Okay. Now it's about people, but it's about team now. That's organization, about team performance. Now, I think many people in Japan, especially young people, would understand that. And they'd understand that Otani-san, for example, is an exceptional player. He's also Japanese, but that's not the point. Well, it is in a way, that's national pride, but he's an exceptional player and he's Japanese. And he has so many diverse skill sets that that's why he's so exceptional. Whereas other players, maybe they have narrower or maybe more focused skill sets. You with me? That's diversity is already there and it's being managed and it's being assessed in terms of its performance. So it's happening already. And I often use these sports analogies in my work, with my MBA students, because, apart from the fact sport is a big business, it's not just a hobby, but also the dynamics, the human dynamics are impressive. And sport teams, you look at successful sports teams around the world, they are increasingly diverse, ethnically, age-wise, in terms of where they were brought up and so on, and their different cultures, different physiques. And so this is an opportunity, this I'm talking about. And that when we talk about diversity management, that is the opportunity for improved performance. Let's work with what we have. And I think for what we are talking about strategy, about maybe encouraging people to question what we perceive as normal or different, that we probably need to start with younger people. It's a basic process of education. Diversity policies in Japanese organizations, and I believe you and other people perhaps listening to this will know this better than I do, but from my observation, many organizations, well-meaning, they have a diversity policy because that's what they're supposed to have now. Maybe it's required by law in some professions, but the approach taken again is the one that's based on the perception of difference. So there'll be quotas, won't there? There'll be quotas for women. There'll be quotas for women employees. There'll be quotas for employees with a disability. There may be a quota for some non-Japanese, but it'd be numbers. And this comes back to the question you asked quite rightly before about how do we measure this so-called promise of improved performance? Well, it's very difficult to. There are ways of doing it, of getting qualitative assessment of performance. And that's again through kind of exit interviews, through debriefings, and through all channels of feedback from people, and through maybe putting competing teams together, like the baseball teams, have a diverse baseball team play against a team of only pitchers and see what happens. I mean, we can almost predict what's going to happen, you know? So it can be measured, but it's, I think, like all innovation, actually, I was teaching a class on Friday about innovation management. It really begins here. It has to. So management innovation is about thinking and innovation, and perhaps we can do that in later life through continuous development and training in organizations and in universities, but I think it needs to start quite young. One of the first countries I went to work in, live in, was Norway. And I think I, as a person from Britain at that time, and I think any people in Japan right now, managers or researchers in diversity, I think it would be a good idea to look at what many organizations in Scandinavian countries do. So my experience was this. I was like 21, 22. I was in Norway, very excited to be there. And I was walking with a friend of mine down a corridor in the place where we worked. And we were talking, and I got to this door, a fire door, you know, in a corridor. So we were just talking, and I just opened the door like this. And then the woman I was walking with just stopped. And she said, "What are you doing?" What do you mean? What am I doing? She said, "What are you doing?" And I realized I had this door handle in my hand. I said, "Well, I've opened the door for you." She said, "Well, why do you think I can't open the door by myself?" And I was 21, 22 from Britain, you know, or sort of low middle class family. And I thought, well, why am I having this conversation? But it was funny, I mean, in the end, but it was serious. And I learned a lot from that. And then obviously when I was talking to other people, women in Norway, people I worked with and friends of people I worked with, I realized this is, it seems a bit exaggerated, and perhaps it was exaggerated at that time. So how could we do that in Japan? Well, you wouldn't have to do that in Japan. What we can do is have role plays. You know, that's the theme of the article I wrote for you recently. It's to take the danger or the threat out of situations like that, maybe even small situations like that. So why should anyone open a door for someone else? Why should a man open a door for a woman? When I thought about it, I realized, well, that's because I did that because that's what my grandmother taught me to do. Now, there's no disrespect to my grandmother, but maybe we live in different times now. So even for a small incident like that, if we do it as a role play, and we can talk about it, perhaps even laugh about it, and say, well, why would we react in that way? And then we could try to say, well, is there any advantage in a man opening a door for a woman? And you say, well, in certain circumstances, yes. If the woman is elderly, if the woman is pushing a pram or so, you know, then we can start to relativize these things and get, you know, to embed them in the real world. So it's not different anymore, it's diverse, it's choices of behavior. But in order to have and enact choice of behavior, we need to recognize that there are choices to be made. And then secondly, that there may be advantages in making certain choices or emphasizing certain choices, as I said before, in terms of performance, improving performance, efficiency or whatever, but also in terms of avoiding the risk of missing opportunity. There's a famous case study about the Toyota Prius, the first hybrid car, you know, and there's a special project group at Toyota. And the researchers, very influential researchers, Takeuchi sensei and Nonaka sensei at Hitotsubashi University, they wrote a lot about this in English. And the Toyota Prius project it's a special project, and the company brought together a lot of specialists from different backgrounds, from marketing, from sales, from engineering, from electronics, they brought in some suppliers, and so they brought them together. And they said from the very beginning, in this project team, there is no hierarchy. It doesn't matter how long you've been in the company. It doesn't matter if you've got a PhD or not a PhD. We are all team members. And they created this space, which again is a concept which I began to learn about here, this concept of bar, this space, which can be physical or virtual or psychological. It's all of these. And within this project space, there is no hierarchy. So there's no leaders as such, but there's leadership. There are opportunities for leadership. Anybody can demonstrate leadership in the project. And how to measure success? Well, that at the time, 1995 to 7, I think, at that time in automobile manufacturing worldwide, including at Toyota, the average time from design, drawing board, we say, from design to actual production, and the production of a vehicle was about 4 years. The Prius project, they did that in 16 months. And this is a new engine. It hadn't been done before, this hybrid engine. Now that, I would suggest, shows diversity management or leadership can work in potentially more complex context for work. Then perhaps the diversity argument becomes more, in my view, in my experience, in more complex working environments. And that generally means because of people. Then diversity management becomes potentially more attractive rather than less, for the reasons I've mentioned earlier on in our talk today. The Global Gender Gap Report. Well, first of all, it's a ranking, and all rankings have methodologies which are more or less valid or reliable also. But at least it's valuable information, and it's important to understand the methodologies. So if we're going to try and improve Japan's position in the Global Gender Gap Report, then we need to look at the methodology used for the Global Gender Gap Report, and then learn the rules of the game, basically, and try to, at least explicitly or cosmetically, but rather with more essence and consistently, understand how we can improve the ranking. So it's like a baseball team. What do they have to do to win over a season? It's a long haul, so they have to go into fine detail. I mean, I want to talk again about diversity management as a strategy, is one approach towards perhaps reducing the risk of missing opportunities. So, for example, in terms of women in management and leadership positions, I mean, in Japan, we can look at examples where there's a strong tradition of women in leadership and management positions. For example, in the hospitality sector, the hospitality industry. I mean, many women have run restaurants and hotels, ryokan, and so on, and still do. Now, not everybody's going to be, wants to be a mama-san in a ryokan or so, but that is an example. That is management, that is business, that is performance. There are examples of that. Then the questions are, and that's what I took from the door moments you call it, and I'll think about it in those terms now. As soon as I walked through that door, we walked through together, I had the question in my mind, and I've carried those questions with me ever since. Why? Why not? What if? You can ask my students, they think I've got this obsession with questions like what if, but that is how we can do it. Why is there such a strong tradition of women in the women managers in the hospitality industry in Japan? It's an interesting question. I'm sure many smart researchers have looked at it. That's one thing to do, is to look at examples like that, rather than focus on, well, why aren't there more women in leadership, managing automobile manufacturers and so on, or chemical industry. I mean, there may be, but why not? And learn from the positives without being naive about this.
Japan up close.